You wake up and the first thing you do is pick up your phone. You go on TikTok or Instagram and start swiping to wake your brain up. Terrible way to start the day, by the way. You get bombarded with everything: politics, war, shopping hauls, beauty routines, and diagnosis. You see a TikTok from a girl who doesn't get out of the house much. She just goes to work, buys groceries, and watches Netflix until the end of the day. Just like you. You feel better. You aren't a loser. That's what people do nowadays. The bare minimum followed by easy pleasures. Wrong. I was just diagnosed with depression, and honestly, now I know that isn't normal, she says. Boom. Are you depressed? You just thought you're a little overworked, the weather sucks, maybe you need some vitamins. But maybe you are depressed. You keep scrolling. A guy in his 20s says nobody wants to go to the club anymore. People just stay home on the weekends and do laundry. Okay, good. Normal for everyone. Wrong again. A guy who stitched that video just said that depression and anxiety levels are at all-time high. So, are you depressed? Overpathologizing is an increasingly more common phenomenon of categorizing completely normal behavior as symptoms of a disorder. It can be a physical disorder, for example, when people start interpreting their moles as signs of skin cancer. But overpathologizing can also happen to mental disorders. For example, when someone who doesn't have energy after work is convinced they are depressed. Or when someone forgetful thinks they have ADHD. Or when someone with special hobbies thinks they have autism. Or when someone who struggles with keeping a relationship going thinks they have borderline. You get the idea. In a lot of those cases, it isn't true. And let me tell you why. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not trying to diminish anyone's struggles by what I'm about to say. Even nowadays, being diagnosed with a mental disorder means dealing with a lot of stigma and stereotypes. I do, however, think that a lot of people, especially those who self diagnose, aren't actually mentally ill at all. First of all, having one or two or even three symptoms doesn't mean that you automatically have that disorder. In the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual used by psychologists and psychiatrists, it is usually stated you need to meet several criteria to get diagnosed with a certain illness. For example, in order to be diagnosed with depression, 5 or more of the symptoms must be present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. Second of all, the symptoms must clearly negatively affect your functioning and life. With most disorders in the DSM, you will find this criteria. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Which means that, for example, if you are forgetful and lose your phone a lot or misplace your keys, but generally speaking, you are doing fine and find ways to deal with that forgetfulness, you probably don't have ADHD. And finally, I'm not trying to echo the classic boomer response, but we all do that when you describe your disorder. But the truth is, many of those behaviors are things we all experience from time to time. What I mean is, we all sometimes lose our keys. We all have times in our lives when we don't feel like getting out of the house. We all sometimes get obsessed with a topic to a point where we lose touch with reality. Because what people with mental disorders go through are the exact same things healthy people go through, just more. More intensely, more permanently, or more painfully. So it's easy to find yourself in a diagnosis. It's easy to read a list of symptoms and think, whoa, I do that. Well, yeah, so do I. That doesn't mean we automatically have this diagnosis. Mental disorders are so hard because they are very total. They take over your entire life. They don't just happen sometimes, they are there all the time. with no escape. Thinking you have a disorder you don't actually have causes several negative effects. Firstly, let's talk about how negatively it can influence you. In psychology, we have this thing called rumination. Rumination involves repetitive thinking or dwelling on negative feelings and distress and their causes and consequences. The repetitive negative aspect of rumination can contribute to the development of depression or anxiety and can worsen existing conditions. Meaning that if you think you have a disorder and obsessively focus on it, your condition can actually get worse. As stated before, you can develop depression or anxiety, or even the symptoms of the disorder you think you have. For example, let's say you think you have autism. You got that idea because you have hobbies you are very involved in and knowledgeable about. Then you start reading about autism. You find out that autistic people have troubles in social functioning, they don't always know how to act appropriately, and have troubles making friends. You start analyzing your life and see those traits in yourself. You omit the examples when you acted accordingly, you forget about the friendships you have or had, you focus on the situations when you didn't do well. In turn, those things start happening more often. You already think of yourself as an autistic person who has trouble making friends, so you act accordingly to what you think of yourself. It really works like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You may even start to be significantly less social, which causes your rumination to worsen, which causes you to be even less social, and so on and so forth. So self-diagnosing can be hurtful, especially to you. That's why we have professionals give diagnosis to people. They take into account multiple factors, including how rumination may influence your opinion on yourself. Sometimes you have a problem that isn't diagnosed per se, but can be resolved by a mental health professional, and that's still completely valid. Your pain and struggles are important even if they don't qualify for a diagnosis. They still deserve recognition, and you still deserve to be helped. The second problem with falsely self-diagnosing is how it influences people who are actually mentally ill. First of all, they may be dismissed. Let me explain this to you using an example of someone with clinical depression. Let's imagine a person who withdrew themselves from social life. They really spend almost their entire time at home, they don't talk to friends and family, they lost interest in all of their hobbies, they barely eat and don't shower or brush their teeth. They start feeling disgusting and worthless, so they start looking for help. First, they may turn to their friends. They start describing their problems. The friend says, "Oh, that's just depression. I have that too." So they analyze that friend. The friend goes out, has a relationship, is successful at work, etc. And sure, someone who is social and successful can still be depressed, but unfortunately, most people aren't. Clinical depression is a tough disorder that's characterized by a lack of motivation among other symptoms. So it's unlikely that unmotivated people will get far in their careers, for example. Anyway, let's go back to our hypothetical person who just compared themselves to another friend who is also depressed. They already feel worse. Technically, they should find a sense of comfort that a friend understands their struggles. Instead, they see themselves as even more worthless because that person keeps going with their life, they aren't tied to their bed and dirty. What's more, they may feel like they don't deserve to look for help any further. Depression is so common nowadays that it barely deserves to be treated, or at least some people think so. And that's another problem caused by this popularization of mental illnesses. For some people, it seems so common that you should figure out how to deal with it on your own. Everyone has it or had it at some point in their life. That's at least what happens with depression, because now there seems to be a hierarchy of mental illnesses, at least on social media apps, especially TikTok. For example, someone with a personality disorder can claim they are doing worse or their problem is bigger than someone with depression or anxiety. And that is completely false. Severity of a mental disorder is in no way based on the type of disorder you are going through. You may be highly functioning with borderline personality disorder or low functioning with anxiety. You may even be low functioning with no disorder at all due to a lot of stress, for example. But even though the discourse around mental health is much more open nowadays, there is still a lot of stigma and stereotypes. People with personality disorders like borderline, which I mentioned before, or narcissistic personality, for example, are often judged as not fit for relationships, which is incredibly harmful. No matter your disorder, you can always get help, get better, and figure out how to be in a happy relationship without hurting the other person. But personality disorders are very complicated. Some professionals to this day think that you can never completely cure them. You can only learn to live with them and deal with your symptoms. And people on social media took that and ran with it. Now everyone's ex was a narcissist who doesn't deserve redemption. He was so inherently bad that everyone should avoid him at all costs. And as much as I get that sometimes you purely hate your ex, I absolutely hate that narrative. Everyone can get better and everyone should look for help. But if you contribute to this discourse that people with certain personality disorders or even traits don't deserve redemption, you are just enforcing the stereotypes around mental illnesses. Because it's easy to feel like there is something inherently wrong with you when people use your diagnosis as the most insulting thing you can say about your ex. And I get where that comes from. Sometimes people post their personal stories to warn others against partners who exhibit certain behavior and to show them where behavior like that can lead. But you can't put everyone in the same basket. Narcissists deserve to get better too. But I guess it's easier to dehumanize them and put all the blame for a relationship falling apart on them. The popularization of certain mental disorders has two sides. On one hand, it's great that support is more available than ever. There is less stigma, and it's not as shameful to admit you may be taking some psychiatric medication or going to a psychotherapist. On the other hand, the more people claim to have a disorder without actually diagnosing it, the more normal it seems to be mentally ill. And that shouldn't be normal at all. It's called a disorder for a reason. It's something you are meant to deal with or cure so you can live happily instead of struggling with it for the rest of your life. So, before you self diagnose, you may want to ask yourself if you really need that diagnosis. I understand that having a name for your problem makes it easier to deal with. However, you can actually harm yourself by obsessively thinking there is something wrong with you, and you may make it harder for people with actual diagnosis to get help. Whether you are diagnosed or not, you deserve help. If you are struggling, you don't need a diagnosis to look for support. Please do look for it and don't think less of yourself if you don't get diagnosed.